turn your mode dial until the indicator line reads M. This will put your camera in manual mode. Manual mode requires you, the photographer, to control all 3 exposure triangle settings: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. To change shutter speed, you're going to use the main dial here. This will allow you to make your camera faster or slower using shutter speed. To change the f-stop value, you will need to use the AV exposure and delete button. Hold that and use the main dial to change aperture. You can open up the aperture or close it off. To change ISO, push the ISO button and click left or right to change the ISO. Hit set when you're ready. When shooting in manual mode, it is absolutely essential that you use your light meter. To activate your light meter, halfway press on the shutter button, similar to when you would use autofocus. You can see my light meter begins to blink down here at -3. This is telling me that I will have at least 3 stops of underexposure. You can see here that the photo is very dark. There's not a lot of detail or color because of that underexposure. Currently, I have my camera set at mid-range values. I can increase or decrease exposure from all 3 pieces of the exposure triangle. I can slow down my camera and allow more light to come in, giving me more light and a proper exposure. I could reset my shutter speed and I could add light with aperture. You'll see that my lens stops me at f4, which means I might need to add light with ISO and shutter speed. Using all 3 pieces of the exposure triangle, I can balance the exposure of my photo. Now personally, I don't like this exposure. It feels a little too bright to me, but I do like that I have a shallow depth of field. The front plants are more in focus and the back plants and camera are kind of going out of focus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease my exposure or my ISO. I'm going to take it down almost all the way, making my camera less sensitive to overall light, therefore giving me 3 stops of underexposure again. But because I have a tripod, I know that I can use a much slower shutter speed and I can gather light slower. I'm still going to take it to 0 on my light meter, and I just want to compare the difference. So now, looking back at these photos, there might not be a huge difference on the camera, but I can tell that this second photo with a 100 ISO is going to be a cleaner photo. It's going to have a lot less noise, and it's going to be much more fun to edit than the 1600 ISO. My personal preference as a photographer is to shoot somewhere in between -1 and 0. So I'm just gonna go a little bit underexposed, and I feel like that gives me a little bit more contrast, a little bit more color in the shadows and highlights. So that's just my personal preference. Your light meter is also there to guide you in live shoot mode. So if you set your camera to live shoot mode right here, using that little camera button, that'll take what's in your viewfinder to the screen, and you'll see this information down below. Here you have shutter speed on the left, then aperture, your light meter is in the middle, and ISO over on the right. I can check my light meter the same way by tapping my shutter button about halfway, and then I can still change my exposure here. This is really helpful if you would like to see like a visual representation of what your exposure might look like at the end of the shot. So if I'm liking it a little bit more overexposed or want to zoom in on a plant and change my exposure, that can be a fun way to see what it's going to look like. Let it focus and get the shot that I saw. Your viewfinder is just glass, so it will never change because this is a DSLR camera. Mirrorless cameras will have an electronic viewfinder where you can more accurately see what exposure might look like. But in our DSLR cameras, this is just glass and a prism and a mirror to our lens. So if you would like to see your exposure change, you're going to need to use live shoot mode right there. It's important to keep checking your light meter consistently throughout a photo shoot, because if I change the direction of my camera slightly, you'll see my light meter change pretty dramatically. So if I point just a little bit up towards the sky, or if I point just a little bit down towards the ground, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, you'll notice that light meter change. The light is never exactly the same, so you'll want to be consistently checking that light meter. There are hundreds of combinations of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO that can be used to make a balanced exposure of any scene. Using your knowledge of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, you can create numerous different photos of the same scene, and we're going to call these equivalent exposures. So this photo I have here is got a 1/5 of a second of a shutter speed and f5.6 and ISO of 100. So I'm going to get a pretty slow shutter speed here. We're going to balance that to 0. Okay, so I've got my camera in focus, a little bit of shallow depth of field in the front here with the plants. And now I'm going to try to make a deep depth of field photo with the same exposure. So what I'm going to do is I'll push on my aperture button, and let's change aperture, and we'll watch that exposure change on my light meter here. I'm going to go as deep as I can here. And then what I'm going to need to do is balance that light up with my shutter speed and my ISO. I'm going to leave my ISO as low as I can because I have a tripod. We'll see how this goes. A 3.2 second photo. We hope we don't get a little bit of camera shake there when I take the photo. I know there's a little glare on my screen here, but we've got 2 photos with the same exposure, but now we have a deep depth of field. So there are hundreds of combinations of these 3 settings that you can use. Maybe you want a really fast shutter speed, you're trying to freeze motion. Maybe we're going to need to open up, increase our ISO. Oh boy, turn that thing up even more. Check your light meter. Ah, perfect. Let's see what we got. Another equivalent exposure. So, using your knowledge of those 3 settings, you can make any photo, anywhere, anytime. Have fun.